Can cartel money pay for President Trump's border security needs? And can newly proposed Senate legislation make it happen? Just how bad is the national crisis on the southern border, and how is it affecting typical Americans? And how is President Trump working with Mexican President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador on border issues? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Today we sit down with Senior Senator from Louisiana, Dr. Bill Cassidy, who recently introduced the Securing the Border and Making Drug Cartels Pay for It Act in the U.S. Senate. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you for being here.
So in the State of the Union, the president called what's happening at the border right now a national crisis. And he also said it's a threat to the safety, security, and financial well-being of all Americans. But some are actually calling it a manufactured crisis. What do you call it?
I think the president put it very well. He said if you're wealthy, living behind fences with guards protecting your property, things are okay. But if you are in the working class, having to have a tattered safety net, people competing for your jobs and lowering the wage base, maybe it's not quite so good. I would add that if you're somebody whose son, daughter, spouse died from a fentanyl overdose, maybe it's not so good. I would also add, if you're a child from Central America who's being trafficked because you were brought here by a coyote, it's not so good. So maybe it depends upon your perspective. Wealthy, behind a wall, manufactured. Tattered safety net, being trafficked, son died of drugs, it is a crisis.
So I want to focus a little bit on your constituency and specifically how this crisis affects the people of Louisiana. Can you speak to that a bit?
So there's different aspects to it. And one aspect, of course, is the contraband which is coming across. Now, there was a recent seizure, I think, of 232 pounds of fentanyl. That could kill the entire state of California. So my state, as every other state, has a death rate from opioids. And a measure of that is fentanyl from south of the border. Now, if we seize this, obviously we decrease supply, death rate should go down. You could say, well, we seized it. I went to McAllen, Texas a couple years ago, and they showed me this big room with contraband. And they had drugs and guns and marijuana and you name it. And I asked them, how much of that which is coming through do you think you're seizing? And they kind of scratched their chin and they said, probably a third. This big room is only a third? So 2/3 still coming through, filtering across the nation. In my state, people dying, it's not hard to make that connection.
How does the physical structure fit into this? There's been some arguments made that, yes, we need some more border security, that's fine, but we definitely don't want a physical structure.
So the president makes it clear he's not talking about a concrete wall from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. He's talking about certain high-trafficked places. And there's areas which every reasonable person concedes that is important. He used the example last night of San Diego, which used to have an incredible amount of foot traffic coming across, and now you cannot. There's a YouTube video. It showed about 1,000 people south of the border, and they just rushed across. The guards tried to tackle, so maybe they got 100 of them. But 900 got through, immediately melted in. Again, going back to McAllen, Texas, they had a wall. It forced people coming up to go one way or the other, making it easier for the agents to capture them when they came across. So they're in an urban setting. Walls, barriers clearly make a difference, make a positive difference.
So we have, speaking of which, we have a number of caravans, from what I understand, coming up right now from South America. A lot of these people probably, based on precedent, aren't going to actually ultimately qualify for asylum. What do you see happening here?
Well, we have to look at why folks are leaving. A friend of mine is from Guatemala, and I asked her about it. And I said, folks come here, they don't have a job, or maybe they're working for cash, but kind of tough situation. She goes, however bad it is here, it is better than it is for them in Guatemala. So we have to look at that which is driving people to leave their homes. We can also look at success stories. I went to Mexico recently, and I asked folks, The first big wave of folks coming from Mexico was when Pancho Villa was marauding across northern Mexico and folks fled to the safety of the U.S. Now we have cartels marauding across. Why are people leaving? And they said that the economic development in northern Mexico, creating jobs for families, gives us stickiness. They don't want to leave their home because they have a job, so they don't leave, even though there's a lack of security. That could be a model. Can we go down, create economic opportunity for people in Central America, a stickiness, if you will, that will keep them there in their community with their job and their family, as opposed to migrating to the U.S.? We have to start thinking of the picture bigger.
So you actually introduced a new bill on, I believe, February 2nd, securing the border and making drug cartels pay for it. You know, pretty clearly named. Can you give us an overview of the bill?
So cartels move anywhere from $60 to $100 billion from the U.S. to Mexico annually from the sale of drugs and other things. Now, we confiscate as a U.S. government about $5 billion of it. So either $5 billion of 60 to $100 billion. Not very much, but we are getting $5 billion. Now, theoretically, the more barriers we have, the more security, the more we would capture some of this money. So my thought was, let's just take this money that we're confiscating and use that to build the barrier. It wouldn't be the Mexican government, it wouldn't be the U.S. taxpayer, it would be the cartels. And that would be poetic, sweet justice. But it would also, hopefully, increase more the amount that we are seizing. So that's my hope. Secondly, that money is already under within the executive branch. Congress would not have to appropriate. So if we're at this impasse where Pelosi doesn't want one more dollar for a barrier, then we actually have dollars within the executive that could be used. Ms. Pelosi could keep her word, but we could still strengthen our security.
So what was the genesis of the idea?
I'm looking very much at trade-based money laundering. The means by which Hezbollah, for example, has moved billions out of the U.S. to the Middle East in order to finance terrorism. The way that, again, the cartels, and Hezbollah and the Mexican cartels will work together. But the cartels will move money down to Mexico to further criminal activity. And when you start looking at it and you realize the sums involved, that's when it seemed to present a solution as to what we could do.
What I've heard that this is sometimes confused with the El Chapo Act that was introduced by Senator Cruz. Can you just tell us the distinction?
It is the same concept, but we probably have a little bit more robust kind of presentation of it. You have to change the law a little bit. The money we're currently confiscating by law can be used for law enforcement to share with local police or state police as they cooperate with our border agents. So we actually have in our provision a change in the law that would allow it to also be used for barriers.
And do you have any sense of what the president thinks of this bill that you're proposing?
Yeah, so I've spoken to the president and I've spoken to other members of his administration about this. I think they want a congressional appropriation. So we're just trying to give the conferees, the negotiators, one more, oh, well, what about this? What can we do to break this impasse? I don't want a government shutdown. I'd rather not have an emergency declaration. So how can we secure our southern border and get everything else done?
So you're not necessarily pushing to pass this bill per se. You're looking at to have it as a tool, perhaps, for the conference?
Correct. The conferees are going to come back with a solution. So this is the way you highlight it, giving them one more chance to say, maybe we can use this.
Wonderful. The conference committee report comes out in, I think, a couple of days. And are you aware of any of the progress that was made there?
You know, you're reading headlines, but probably the most important headline is that even though Democratic negotiators apparently are open to money for protection, for barriers, Ms. Pelosi is still dug in. So the president clearly has signaled a willingness to compromise. Democratic negotiators have signaled a willingness to find common ground. It is Ms. Pelosi who is the outlier, who is kind of, no, we cannot. She would rather another government shutdown and our drugs continuing to come across our border at the rate they are than coming up with something which has been adopted by multiple presidential administrations, which is that barriers work.
What do you think the issue is with that?
I can't speak for her, of course, but I can imagine. There is a wing of the Democratic Party which is truly for an open border and wishes to abolish ICE. And they see nothing wrong with the entirety of the rest of the world pouring across that border. Now, if you push them, no, we don't want MS-13. And if we push them, no, we don't want folks coming from Southeast Asia just coming across for no other reason than they'd rather be here. But you have to push them, and they will not adopt the policies to limit that. And the idea that people seriously talk about abolishing ICE is just absurd. They've never been to McAllen, Texas to see that which I've seen, which is the confiscated drugs, guns, and money.
So the president has called, during the State of the Union, this whole situation actually a moral issue. What are your thoughts on that? Again,
I'll go back to an earlier exchange we had. If you're a working class family and the social safety net is tattered and there's school systems which are overburdened with teachers who are underpaid relative to the number of students they see, et cetera, and maybe you feel as if your jobs are being, your wage base is being undercut, aren't you upset? Shouldn't you be upset? If your standard of living is less, so your child goes to a school which is not quite as good, your marriage has more tension because money is tighter, shouldn't we be upset? Can we perceive that as a moral issue? I think we can. It's a basic issue of fairness.
February 15, you know, that's the deadline that the president put in place. What is your ideal scenario on February 15th that you can imagine happening?
I think they want to have, by this Friday, an initial outline. I would like it that the president has shown a willingness to compromise. He is willing to make a deal for the DACA kids and even for those on temporary protected status. Most Americans have a sense that they're willing that there be an accommodation for these two groups. In return, that the Democratic Party would come forward and agree to funding for a barrier. I think both sides get something that they've been advocating for. If the Democrats are serious that they want something positive done for the children, the DACA children, and they agree that, my gosh, Obama built fences, why shouldn't President Trump be able to build fences, then that should be the deal. And there was a sense that the new president of Mexico, he's called by AMLO, and our President Trump would not get along well. But they've actually collaborated very well. When I was in Mexico, I was informed by our embassy that the Mexicans, with our assistance, have recently stood up a way to monitor everyone coming from south of their border into Mexico. And they found that many of those coming into Mexico are the type of folks that Mexico does not wish to have. Now, some of them will transit all the way to the U.S., some stay in Mexico. And like I said, Mexico doesn't want some of these folks. They also found that people were coming from Somalia and Pakistan and Korea and India, not just from Guatemala or the Northern Triangle. So I think the president needs to be complimented for this cooperation he's gotten in a relationship that is critical to our country with Mexico, to limit the migration and to otherwise process people in a way which does not force our hand. It's a little bit against type, but the president commonly goes against type.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan.